Before, be Before becoming an arborist, Kyle was a climbing instructor and wilderness guide with a degree in history. Once he decided on his path as an arborist, he began a 4-year apprenticeship and 2 years in the Humber College Arboricultural Urban Forestry program before spending the next year working as a journeyman in Australia, where he created ironwood arboricultural solutions. Since then, Kyle has continued to develop his knowledge of plant biology, the biochemistry of decay, and the impacts of invasive species on our urban forest. This is, as I mentioned, our 4th year hosting these Ask an Arborist webinars with Kyle, and we're especially thrilled to have him back tonight to share the presentation about native trees and pest management because, as I mentioned, he just welcomed a new baby into the world with his wife. So congratulations to Kyle, and thanks again so much for sharing. I know parenting, I'm sure, has kept you very busy. So Kyle's going to take over and present until about 7:45 or maybe a little bit after that. And then we will make sure that we have lots of time for questions. So handing the screen over to the very wonderful Kyle McLoughlin.
Thank you very much, Kale. Good evening, everyone. And just another friendly reminder, if you are attending, ask that you please put your microphones and your cameras off. As many of you can see, I'm on camera right now. Because I am out in the bush, I will turn it off just to preserve bandwidth, because we all know how that kind of works. I've got a lot I want to talk about, just like Kale said. I could fill a couple hours, but I want to keep you all interested, and I'm really interested in your questions. So I'm going to stop my video, and I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. Okay, folks. So first and foremost, typically speaking, I am the supervisor of forest planning and health for the City of Burlington. Obviously, at this point right now, I am on parental leaves. My wife and I had our first kid, and I've taken some time off. But I just love doing this Ask an Arborist event with Burlington Green, and especially during National Forest Week. So this was a nice thing to be able to set up, and glad that we can make it work even while I'm out here in the bush. First thing, I just wanted to make a quick note on before we get into my larger presentation, bring everybody's attention to spotted lanternfly. This is an invasive pest that at this point right now hasn't been identified in Canada, but we're really on the lookout for it. The Forest Planning and Health team has monitoring going on right now, and what we're trying to do is to see if we can catch it before it catches us off guard, because typically with a lot of these invasive species, they come in and they're in the country for years and years before we can actually find them. So what is the spotted lanternfly? They're true bugs, so they're kind of related to stink bugs or soldier bugs, or some of you may be familiar with box elder beetles, which aren't true beetles, they're actually true bugs. They're native to Southeast Asia, especially China. They feed by sucking sap out from trees. They're a big risk to our fruit tree population. Now you see it's got these black spots, and it's kind of a beigey pink. The thing about it is that it really reproduces in a massive at a massive rate. All life stages on the insect have distinctive spots, so this is important to remember. When they're young, they're quite small, but they can get up to an inch or more in length once they reach adulthood, which when you have hundreds of them, it can actually be quite awful. I've had colleagues who have been down in Pennsylvania, especially in Philadelphia, where it's quite bad, and they were saying you couldn't even sit on a patio and have lunch without being harassed by these things. It's the life stage, and this kind of going to tie into our talk today as we talk about the city itself, what we do in forest plant health, kind of empower and educate you as residents of the city of Burlington. So just recognizing the first instar. So see there on the one side. Let me see if I can put my pointer on there. Let's put a little pen. Kale, can you see me circle this? Can you just confirm if you can see that?
I saw the yes.
Can't hear you there,
Yes,
Kale. I hope I didn't lose everyone. You see the circle. Perfect. Yes. Okay. So the first instar is when the insect starts growing, when it hatches, and you can see on the side it's just a black and white spotted creature. Once it gets to its Once it gets to its fourth instar, that's when the color really comes in here. That's July, September, with it really hitting this point. Now, see here, it says July through December. That's not in Canada. That's in down in the States, like I said, Pennsylvania, um, Tennessee, things like that, where they have it. Um, it starts to lay eggs September, December, which is when we go out to monitor, and the eggs will last typically through the winter. Interesting thing about the eggs is that they're very subtle. So if you look at this picture I have here on the right-hand side, that's an LDD or spongy moth egg cask. This one here, this is the egg cask for the spotted lanternfly. Notice it's very, it almost looks like a little bit of cement. And this is the big thing to watch out for with these because they, oh boy, they lay their eggs anywhere. They lay it on plastic, they lay it on rubber, like truck tires, they lay it on steel, even corrugated or rusted steel, like trains. Things that move invasive insects really far are things that this insect likes to lay its egg masses on. So just to repeat that, things that can help move the invasive species are exactly what this invasive species likes to lay its eggs on. So this is one of the reasons why we're really looking out for it in the city of Burlington, because where we are, we're at this confluence of a bunch of different highways, and especially the QE coming from the United States. So we are expecting it to come and hit Vineland because one of its main hosts are grapevines, fruit trees, cherry trees, right? Vineland is a particular risk to this invasive pest. Now, why do we worry about it in the city of Burlington? Well, the adult spotted lanternfly, like tree of heaven, black walnut, weeping willow, and about 38,000 trees that we have in our inventory. Now, to be clear, the city of Burlington has about 82,000 trees in our inventory, so nearly 45% of our of the trees in the city of Burlington's urban forestry inventory are vulnerable to this pest. So if we think of emerald ash borer, which affected 10% of the trees in the country or in the city, were vulnerable to emerald ash borer only targeted one genus of trees. Spotted lanternfly targets many genuses of trees. And tree of heaven, we're not a big fan of it. It's invasive, but we don't have the funding to actually go and hunt out tree of heaven just to cut them down. And in some cases, we don't want to cut them down if we can help it because they're trees in public parks. And what we want to do is replace those trees in a planned fashion. We just don't want to go nuts and start cutting them down just willy-nilly because it's not a good way to spend money or plan urban forestry management. Okay. Where are you going to find eggs? Apple trees, red maple. Now this is a particularly, hopefully sends a point home. This one on the right-hand side that I'm circling, that apple tree that is absolutely covered in those spotted lanternfly. Now you'll note what's happening. Those spotted lanternflies are actually piercing the bark with their piercing sucking mouth parts and sucking the sap out of the tree, and essentially sucking the life out of the tree. And one or two of them isn't a big deal, but when you have hundreds of them like that, that can really stress out a mature tree, especially those old grapevines, old apple trees, pear trees, cherry trees, things like that. Now, tree of heaven is an important one that everybody out there should be aware of anyway, because this is an invasive tree. It's one of the few trees that are listed as invasive by the province of Ontario. So just an interesting thing to kind of keep an eye out. Damage done. So the nymph stage, the small stage, really affects the grapevines and things like that. And it can be a bit of a nuisance. If any of you have struggled with aphids, think of these as like a giant aphid. They're in the same family. So they'll put out honeydew as well, which is sticky, and sooty mold too. At the adult stage, another thing to keep in mind, lanternfly, it focuses on larger trees and can kill those trees. Now, one point on this slide here, you'll notice the picture. We've got quite a bit of eggs that have been laid on this tree. And those are, it looks at first, it looks like bark. Those are all egg masses, right? So you've got 4 adults and countless egg masses on that piece of tree. How has it spread? Well, it was first discovered in 2012. They believe it came on landscaping this is a big thing. It's very subtle, and this is what I want to educate everybody here on. So we are expecting spotted lanternfly to make its way into Canada in 2025, and our our current sort of ballpark is 2027. Of course, we don't have a crystal ball, but it's just hoping that if it does arrive in the country, the Canada Food Inspection Agency um, will have a plan to at least slow its advance. Um, so, just like I said, how will it actually affect the city of Burlington? 170 different species have been marked as possible hosts worldwide. 20% of the tree species, or about 20%, 20 species are known to be high risk. So, I note that I said about 36,000 of our trees. A big portion of those would be your walnuts, your maples, things like that, willows. 19,775 are high risk, though, which is quite something. Um, as far as mitigation methods, it's not particularly easy because you can use soap as a chemical control, but chemical controls are expensive, as many folks out there know. And this is part of what I'm going to be talking about today, actually, in the bottom right-hand corner. You see you've got 5 stages: chemical control, physical or mechanical control, biological control, low toxicity chemical control, and chemical control. Those are 5 different stages of integrated pest management. So this is one of the things that we try and practice at the City of Burlington, and what most urban foresters try to practice, because it's good arboriculture and good urban forestry practice, not just to spray things for the sake of spraying them, but to try and control pests in an integrated manner, because A, it's usually cheaper in the long run, and B, it's more effective. Okay, so what happens if you see it? The Canada Food Inspection Agency has a program. We often say if you happen to see it in the city of Burlington, take a photo of it, call Service Burlington, and create a service request for urban forestry staff to get in touch with you. And it would be someone from the forest planning and health team who would reach out and follow up to investigate. And then if they determine that it's worthwhile to call the CFIA, that's a good thing. I always caution folks, if you call the CFIA right away, sometimes it can blow things up unnecessarily. Keep that in mind, because if you call them and then they come down with lights, sirens, helicopters, tanks, it could be a little bit jarring. No, we don't need the ink annotations. So now we're going to jump over to IPM principles, which is what I was leading into there. Now, how are we for time? It's 7:26. Kale, how are we looking on your end?
Looking great.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to do what I can to get through these integrated pest management principles. The subtitle being Working with Decay. Now, if you notice on the bottom, we've got Get Involved, burlington.ca/forestry. We encourage everybody to visit that site to talk about or
Oh,
to see what we're
sorry,
actually up
Kyle.
to in forestry.
Kyle,
Oh,
it's
a
still
little bit
on
of
the
lag.
spotted lantern fly slide.
Oh, thank you, Kale. This is that.
Mm.
Remember, we were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, I just thought you
Okay.
meant like the presentation. I meant the presentation's going great, but I can't see your screen.
There we go. Okay, hold on a second here.
Got it.
How's
IPM
that?
principles.
Lovely. Okay. So you'll see on the subtitle, Get Involved, burlington.ca/forestry. Really encourage everybody to go there, check it out, and get your name on our mailing list. I have a personal goal of getting 250 people on our mailing list by the end of 2025. I think we can do it. But the idea being, if we're having a tree giveaway, if we're having a planting event, if we're celebrating something for National Forest Week, you get on that list, you're going to be the first to know. People get a little bit of a heads up if they're on that mailing list, and we're really excited to work with our staff in communications and get involved to help us engage folks in the public, because it's a big part of what we do. Some of you may know, and as we move forward, I want to teach everybody about the parts of the tree, pest disease, defining what integrated pest management is, just to kind of talk about what we do in forest planning and health, and maybe empower you a little bit to know, when do I call an arborist? When should I call the city? Is this something I can take care of myself? Some of you may know, we actually just passed, or council just passed in April, our urban forest master plan. It's supposed to be a 20-year master plan. We've dated it 2025 partly because like the date of 2025 is when it really officially starts. But the goal there is to get us to 35% canopy cover by 2061. Now, a lot of people say, well, it used to be 2040. We had to adjust it because it's a really audacious goal to get 35% canopy cover in 20 years. And I welcome everybody's questions about that. What I will say is one of my favorite parts about this urban forest master plan and about the woodlot management strategy that also passed is that it's allowed us to really highlight just how rich our forests are in Burlington. We've got 285 hectares and we're working really hard to maintain them. For the first time ever in Burlington's history, we actually have an opportunity to focus on maintaining our woodlots proactively as opposed to reactively. And with that, I do encourage, or I'll plant that seed. If any of you want to ask questions at the end about the urban forest master plan or the woodlot management strategy, I'd love to get them. Okay, so what are we trying to hit here today? Professional skills, right? Diagnosing, understanding, and management. That's a big one for me. I love diagnosis and I love kind of solving problems and preventing decay problems. One of the things that I found, decay is a reason that a lot of trees are cut down prematurely. A lot of people think a tree that is decaying needs to come down because it's unsafe. And what I really want to hit home is it's important to know what species of decay you're dealing with, because not all decay is created equal, just like not all trees are created equal. Okay, a little bit more of my background. I have a history degree. Cale did an excellent introduction. I don't need to go too far into it. The long and short of it, I have a practical trades certificate. I have other professional certificates. If anybody out there is interested in learning about how they get into the industry, I welcome those questions later on. Definitions, these ones are kind of always a little bit spicy to say. Introduced, what's the difference between an introduced, a native, and an invasive species? So an introduced species is one that is outside of its native range due to human action. So Pinus niger, which is your Austrian pine, it's been brought over from Austria. Does it reproduce in the native environment? Not really, but it does reproduce in the built environment, which is like the city. What's a native tree? Present in a region due to natural process, like our sugar maples. And invasive is something that comes and has a tendency to spread with impunity and harm the environment. That would be like your Agrillus planipennis, otherwise known as your emerald ash borer. Okay. What are plant hardiness zones in Canada? If you're ever dealing with plant health, this is the most important thing to note. So where we are in Burlington, we're at about a 6A, kind of in some spots of Hamilton, you notice there's it's quite dark. That's your 7A area. I'm gonna put my pointer out, pen, right? This area here, that's Vineland. That's where we get all the warm grapes, or warm environment for grapes and cherries. As the environment warms and as the climate changes, we're expecting to see the hardiness zones change towards the trending warmer. So where we are in Burlington right now, we're a 6A. In the future, we expect to be closer to a 6B or a 7A. Always worthwhile knowing, because sometimes people will say, oh, I can't grow this tropical palm outside. How come? It's like, well, what's the growing range? And somebody will say, oh, it's a 9. Okay, well, we're a 6, so it's way out of range. Usually easiest way to answer a question. So what kind of pests are we talking about when we talk about integrated pest management? We've got diseases, insects, and other plants. So other plants will be competitors. That's like buckthorn or Japanese, not weed, two particularly annoying invasives we have in the city that we try to manage, but it's expensive and you don't get a great return on investment. Insects, that would be like your spotted lanternfly, like we talked about, Asian longhorn beetle, gypsy moth, or now known as spongy moth, or emerald ash borer. And then, of course, diseases, sudden oak wilt, butternut canker, which is what that photo is right there. That's the weeping, that black weeping is from butternut canker. And it affects not just butternuts, but primarily butternuts. Dutch elm disease, it's an old one that many folks would be familiar with, which still affects elms from time to time. And beech bark disease is a headache if you have a woodlot. I can tell you that much. Just to give everybody an idea, what exactly are we looking at when we talk about invasive species? It is a massive, massive list. This is not exhaustive, but chestnut blight, which many people don't remember, was a significant issue in North America in the early 20th century. It used to be that a squirrel could cross North America from the Maritimes all the way into the Great Lakes, never touching the ground, only through chestnut canopy. Nowadays, you can't find a chestnut tree to save your life. True chestnuts, and this isn't horse chestnuts that we plant on our street sides, but a true chestnut. They're incredibly rare, and for folks like myself who love trees, I would love to grow one, but they're hard to even find saplings. They're almost extinct. Dutch elm disease is another invasive, right? The big ones we worry about right now. Marbled crayfish is something that in forestry we don't touch, unfortunately, but it's because our thing, because we're focused on trees. Tree of heaven is a big one. Sudden oak wilt is another one. So what I'll say to most folks when we're talking about sudden oak wilt, don't prune your oaks between April 1st and October 31st. Oak pruning season is November 1st to the end of March. That's your oak pruning season. Prune your oaks in the winter. Don't prune them in the summer because of sudden oak wilt. If you prune your tree in the summertime and it catches sudden oak wilt, even if it's a massive 100-foot tall oak tree, it can die in a matter of weeks, not to be trifled with. So when we're trying to understand trees and when we're trying to understand integrated pest management, it's important to understand the parts of the tree. And I always boil it down to 5 different parts. There's the foliage, there's the cambium, there's the vascular system, that's the stuff that moves nutrients throughout the wood. There's the roots, and then there's decay. And decay is the wood of the tree itself. So there's a bit of a difference between a vascular system and the wood. The wood, when I talk about that, I mean like the structure and the organism, the part organism that moves water. The vascular system is part of what moves water, nutrients, both up and down the tree. So fungal ID, I don't expect anybody to really gain that much here. The goal of this is just to teach you a little bit about how integrated pest management works, how to diagnose, and show you that there's a lot to learn. And it's really fun. We could spend 8 hours on fungal ID, and I've done that in the past, but really the goal right now is just to say there's 2 major groups, ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. Basidiomycetes are like your mushrooms, your bracket fungi, things like that. It's always helpful to recognize the signs of the genus and the species and understand that most mycelia will look the same. But you have a question about that, bring it to me later. When you're starting to understand fungal ID, it's important to look at the different parts of the mushroom. And the reason I say this is understanding and identifying the mushroom is the first step towards identifying and understanding the problem with the tree, right? So when you're looking at the mushroom, look at all the parts. Sometimes in forestry, people will email us and they'll say, oh, there's a mushroom in my tree. I need to cut down. It's like, what's the mushroom? Well, that doesn't matter. There's a mushroom. It actually does matter. Some mushrooms are really good for the tree and are a sign of healthy soil and good air quality. Other mushrooms are terrible for the tree and are a major red flag, and it means we need to action on them immediately, or at least inspect them immediately. And so this is why we say, if you're going to get in touch with us, give us a bit of a description, right? What does it look like, right? And then that sometimes they don't last that long. They can last for days. Sometimes they can last for weeks, months, or years. This one is one of my favorites. So I always say to folks, if you're going to send in a photo, right, it's always good to get a few different angles. So on the top here, we have the top-down view, and going from left to right, we've got your turkey tail. If you ever see turkey tail growing on a tree in the city, usually it means you need to get the tree inspected. In the one in from the left, this one right here, this is your tinder conch. You see that a lot on beech trees and on birch trees. Fun fact, Etsy the Eights man, the mummy that they found in the Swiss Alps, actually had this tree. It's known as tinder conch because it's really good at carrying a coal. Friendly reminder to everybody, if you could just please make sure that your microphones are muted as well, because it's going to make things a lot easier for all of us. One in from the right, we've got that's your dryad saddle or pheasant back. Very common when folks phone me and they say, oh, there's a mushroom growing out of my tree. I usually ask them if it looks like the USS Enterprise. Shout out to any Trekkies out there. It really does look like that. And for those of you who have seen it once or twice, I hope that burns it into your mind. And then ultimately on the right-hand side, this is your birch strop fungus. This is one that I always say to folks is a bit of a red flag. If you have a birch tree and you have this growing out of it, the tree probably needs to come down. That's a big red flag. And so if you happen to see this, I always encourage folks to call their arborist when they see this so that they can get an informed decision on how to manage the tree. Okay, so diagnosing issues. How do you actually get informed management choices? You can't manage what you can't measure. And I say RUM principles. So RUM stands for recognize, understand, and manage. So you see there's an arrow. It doesn't start with management, right? It doesn't even start with understanding. It starts with recognizing what we're dealing with. Not every problem is solved the same way. And so before we actually start to do a prune, and this is sometimes people will say, oh, it takes forever for the city to do anything. Well, sometimes it's a matter of understanding what the circumstances we're dealing with. I've had people say, well, the tree needs to come down, right? Like we were talking about. It's a sugar maple. And what's the environment? Well, it's a healthy woodlot. And what's the pest or disease? There's a mushroom. Well, if we identify the mushroom, sometimes we'll find out that it's mycorrhizal. Like a sugar maple, and the environment is a place where there was recently construction, right? A home was recently torn down and rebuilt, and the tree experienced some construction damage, and there's been some grading changes. Well, at that point, now we have a better idea of what the pest or disease is, and if we see a mushroom and we identify it, we can go from there to understanding at what stage of the disease the mushroom is at, where it's going to go, and what the ultimate future is going to be for the tree. And only once we understand the pathology, right, the path that the fungus or the disease takes from past, present to future, only then can we actually begin to manage the tree appropriately. And when it comes to a municipality, that means we have to look at all of the techniques. We have to look at what the budget is, how much money do we actually have, what it will look like, and what's the ultimate risk. Because the bottom line for municipality and really for most homeowners is, what's the risk? This tree is really beautiful, but if I know that it's going to crush my house, I'm not going to take that risk. And this is a big thing for us is we need to walk that fine line between managing risk and extending the life cycle of the trees that we love so much. And this is one of the reasons why identification is really important. Someone sent me a thing once and said, oh, I'm really worried about this. And I said, why? And they said, well, it looks like my tree has cedar apple rust. This is weird. That looks like a picture of lichen. This is cedar apple rust. And this is why I asked that question earlier, because it's what I always find it's important for folks to recognize. Cedar apple rust is a matter of understanding the host, right? The environment, and then you can understand the pest. In this circumstance, it doesn't really have the orange stuff. It kind of looks like a ball, but this is what I was saying to that person was like, okay, this green thing, the lichen, the old man's beard, was growing on a cedar up in northern Ontario. And cedar apple rust does grow on cedars, but you notice the color is very distinct, that orange. And the important part about cedar apple rust is it jumps from pear trees or apple trees back to junipers, not real cedars, interestingly enough. Here's another shot of it late in the season, which is where it is now. All those little white things, those are meant to actually send out spores. And those spores, they won't actually go to pears or apples. They'll go to your junipers this year. And then next year, the pieces that are in the juniper will infect the pears and vice versa, right? How do you manage that? That's a cultural control. So you're going to actually break up those leaves, and ideally, you look at the host environment. Well, the issue with the environment that the two hosts there. You got your pear, an apple, and you got your juniper, cedar apple rust. Important thing to note. This goes for another invasive pest that many folks out there have probably seen, which is box tree moth. Now, box tree moth is an invasive pest that was discovered in Toronto in 2018. And if you have a boxwood, I encourage you to educate yourself on this. It is a very prolific invasive. It's very difficult to get rid of because it has 6 generations a year. And most boxwoods I've seen over the last season, they may have started the season good. They're finishing pretty weak. If you want to manage it, you can, but you need to use biological controls. BTK is the bacteria, and I encourage questions about that later. I do like BTK as a chemical or biological control because it does, it's pretty targeted. It doesn't affect anything outside of caterpillars. And once again, just going back to this is the important part on identification, because I had somebody reach out and say, "Oh, there's a white moth. I want to see if you can get rid of it." And I said, "Can you send me a photo?" And they sent me the photo of this one on the left-hand side here, a similar photo at least of a leopard moth. And you see the other one, the photo on the right is a caterpillar of the leopard moth. You see, it looks nothing like the actual box tree. And so they wanted to get rid of these leopard moths. And I was like, well, these look beautiful. I don't know if it is a box tree. Just hold off. And we did an identification. We figured out, nope, it is not a problem. So don't spend any time, money, or energy trying to deal with something that's not an issue, right? So how do you stop problems from getting to your trees? Well, let's just take a quick look at our time here. We're at 7:44. I think we've hit a few parts that are worthwhile. So I'm going to offer to Kale. Do you want me to continue on, or do you want to go to some questions?
I think we're good to continue on right now. I just saw another question in the chat, but right now we have one, two, three, four questions. So I think we're good for probably another at least 10 minutes of presentation.
Cool. Perfect. That sounds good. I'll keep moving on. So vector management. This is one people say, what the heck is a vector? Sounds like a video game. Actually, there was a really good video game in the 90s called Vector Man. But anyway, that's not an IPM related discussion. But vector management is basically how do the diseases move from one place to another, and how can we as owners of trees or caretakers of trees prevent those diseases from moving. And so there's three major pieces I always encourage folks. Nursery stock. So if you're planting trees, where are those plantings coming from? If you're pruning, here you pruning an oak during summer is poor vector management. You are actually being the vector of disease by wounding the tree and opening it up to the risk of sudden oak wilt. So the other thing, pruning, I say here, do you sterilize your tools? If you're working with apple trees, fire blight is a big issue, especially in older apple trees. You should actually be sterilizing your cuts, or sterilizing your tools in between cuts. How reasonable is that? To a degree, right? I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail. I've done it with my trees, but I also love them dearly, and it's my passion, so it's not a big deal. But it's a good way to prevent the spread of disease. And finally, construction protection. And this is one of the reasons why we have a tree protection program in the city of Burlington. That bylaw is meant to protect trees from damage. Now, I say prevention and cure. It's way easier to protect construction impact than it is to remedy damage after construction impact has happened. Root shatter is a big thing, digging near roots. Best thing to do if you're digging near roots, find out where the root is and where the extent of excavation is, and actually prune those roots properly. That's a good arborist will be able to help you do that with an air spade, which is an air hose. It's meant to dig without actually damaging roots. And also recognizing accountability. Contractors and the contractors that you should be accountable for the contractors you hire, and the contractors you hire should be accountable for the work that they do. If you are hiring someone to work around a tree in the city of Burlington, you should understand that you need a tree protection permit, especially if it's a city tree. Even if it's a small one, you need to make sure that you protect those trees, because we know what the impact of damage can be. And if we know that a tree is damaged, we can monitor it. So this is always an important part when you're trying to investigate, right? Are you moving dead wood, and are you moving infected wood? So this is just a boring insect. I'm not sure what it is. Very likely a two-spotted pine sawyer. Common. This is a pine tree. But the reason I say this, one of the most common vectors for invasive diseases is transporting firewood, right? Cutting this tree down and moving it. It's not to say, oh, this is great burning wood. Maybe it is. But if you take that from, say, Burlington up to your cottage in Muskoka, now you've brought something that could infect or infest all of the other trees on your property, right? And you didn't even notice. So keep that in mind if you're ever out looking and thinking, oh, I could transport wood. Don't do it. Please don't do it. It's very, very risky and it can cost taxpayers a lot of money. So how do we manage? So this is the the interesting part is that prevention is always the best way to go. But once we recognize the pest, we understand what we're dealing with, what are the ways that we manage? So there's 5 ways I talked about at the beginning. We were talking about spotted lanternfly. There's physical or mechanical, so that's pruning. There's chemical, that's spraying. There's cultural, so we don't plan to host or minimize monoculture. So an example here is I have a bunch of apple trees on my property. I'm not going to plant any junipers. Or in the case of the city of Burlington, we don't want to plant a monoculture because it's going to make us vulnerable to Asian longhorn beetle, spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer. So we'll control. That's actually part of our integrated pest management practices as professionals. Also understanding that what kind of pests are we dealing with, right? If they're microscopic, they reproduce quickly and they affect their host quickly, right? The smaller they go, the faster they grow. And usually once they're in, you're not getting them out, especially when we're talking about fungi. And especially, I say this all the time, when it comes to decay. Um, Now, this is a really nice physical control method. So this is a pruning method. This is a sweet gum, which is another tree that we're really trying to push out in the city of Burlington. We quite like sweet gums. You can see here on the left, this is the before. See how it's got a really long limb right here? This is the after. So that long limb has actually been pruned back. You can see in the center, we've got the main scaffold limbs on the right-hand after side. They're quite healthy and happy. They've been actually reduced. And in the case on the left-hand side, you see there's 3 here. 2 of those were really pruned back hard to encourage just one single leader. This is a good way to maximize the life of the tree when you're dealing with certain pests like twig boring beetles who exist to basically shorten branches naturally, or if you're dealing with structural issues in trees. And sometimes that can happen in the urban environment because if we prune trees well from a young age, they can have better structure. And if they have better structure, they can live longer. And that's really what our goal is. We want trees to be preserved and to live as long as possible. So how do you prevent fungal infections? Transportation and sourcing. Where are you moving it and what are you planting? On the bottom right-hand side here, or pardon me, the bottom last, rhizosphere is very common on your Colorado blue spruce. Colorado blue spruce is it was planted a lot because it's the right environment. Canada's cold in the summer, in the winter, and warm in the summer. Colorado is cold in the summer and warm in the cold in the winter and warm in the summer. Difference is Colorado is a lot drier. Here in Ontario, especially, it's quite humid because we're in the Carolinas, and so that humidity makes for a very good environment for rhizosphere and needlecast, which is what you will see a lot in your Colorado blue spruce. So, how do you prevent it? Source trees that are good for the environment you're planting them in, right? And make sure when you do source trees, you're not planting ones that are sick from the moment you plant them, which happens a lot. When it comes to insects, you need to be able to ID. ID is very important. If you don't ID properly, you can spray unnecessarily, and that's never good because spraying, especially when it comes to chemical control, is hard on the environment. Also understanding your timing. We get this question a lot. Can you spray for this pest? We can, but it's going to be next year. Why can't you spray now? Because the window isn't right. On the left-hand side here, we have this thing called phenology, which is the timing of pests based on when other trees or plants are open. So when red bud is in bloom, it is the right time to spray for Cooley spruce gall adelgid, which is another insect that affects your spruce trees. If you spray for Cooley spruce gall adelgid in September, you won't do anything. There's no chemicals that work and you won't be able to control the pest. So you have to wait until the right time of year. Same goes for elm leaf miner. On the other side here, timing pest, this right here is your box elder beetle, not a true beetle. It's actually more closely related to your spotted lanternfly. This isn't a major issue unless you have a female Manitoba maple. They're not interested in male Manitoba maples. But if you have a female and you remove the female, you will actually see these issues subside. Chemical controls. So pros and cons. I always like to point this out. Broadband, if you're using horticultural oil and soap, that is a much better thing to use to kill absolutely everything in your garden. It's nice because it's simple, but anything that gets touched by it will be killed by it. On the other side, we've got BTK and Louside chondro. Louside chondro has a very specific window. It affects buckthorn and a few other trees. BTK affects only caterpillars. So when you have a specific one, you're only going to affect what you're trying to control. The kicker, though, is that usually it's quite expensive. And once again, that timing is really important. Making new problems. If you use a broadband, sometimes you can actually make things worse, especially if you spray to control insects during the day. In the summertime, you can actually burn your plants, which is going to be worse than the insects themselves. Pruning apples, we already understood that. Okay, so fungi. We've talked about this. Where are you going to find fungus? Just to recap, foliage, cambium, vascular system. Those are the really big ones. Fungi that cause disease, right? Tar spot, armillaria. I've highlighted this one because armillaria is actually a mushroom that is and a decay fungus. Characteristically affecting the health of the tree. Their microchemical treatments don't work great. Physical treatments are good, but they take a lot of time and they're still quite expensive. Prevention is ideal. Black knot here, one of the names that we have in the industry as arborists is poop on a stick, and you can probably tell why. Affects a lot of your cherries. And the thing with that is when it gets really bad, it's quite hideous. And usually it affects the tree so much that it will affect the health long term and leads to the premature death of the cherry tree. Fungi that decay wood, they're a little bit different, right? So some of them I mentioned earlier in those slides at the beginning. Characteristic, they primarily affect the structure. They will affect the tension or there's a typo there. Generally will affect the tension or compression strength of the wood. And there's no treatment, there's only prevention. And once they're in, the best thing that you can do is keep the tree as healthy as possible. There's no magic bullet, there's no chemical control to get fungus out of the tree once it's in there. Once it grows into the tree, it becomes a part of the wood and is inseparable. Bacterial ones are always interesting to me because normally in the industry, it's the fun guy, but I like to bring up bacteria because you don't see a lot of bacteria. The two big left-hand picture there, that's that oozing. It can shorten the life of the tree for sure. Is it worth worrying about? Typically not. And then fire blight, that's a bigger one, and it leaves that burnt looking factor to your leaves, will affect everything in the Rosaceae family. So that's your service berries, that's your mountain ash, that's your apples and your pears and roses in general. But your floral roses don't see this problem typically. They reproduce differently and faster than fungi. You have to be really careful. Fire blight especially can really make a tree's life miserable. Okay, so that was about our 10 minutes right there. We'll look at that. We've got just the one last piece I'm going to say before we go too far into this or before I go over white rot. So this is the big thing with decay. Not all decay is created equal. It's actually on a spectrum. It's not just white rot or brown rot, but ideally the colors give you an idea of what is broken down. Over 90% of decay fungi are white rot fungi. They break down the lignin, tensile strength remains. There's a very small percentage, I want to say it's 7% of identified decay fungi are brown rot fungi. And that means they degrade the cellulose. They leave a little bit of compressive strength, but they're not great. They're usually what we would consider red flags. They require more management than others. Here's an example of white rot. So you see I'm peeling parts of the bark off and it leaves it in little strips like paper. Paper is white. That's how I remember. White rot, looks like paper, makes the wood soft and punky and stretchy. And finally, we're going to put this out there. How do trees react to decay? Not all trees are good compartmentalizers, right? So poplars, birches, willows, horse chestnuts, some ash, apples, and cherries are weak compartmentalizers. Decay gets in there. They have a really hard time compartmentalizing it, putting up floodgates to stop it. On the other hand, we've got your strong compartmentalizers. That's your oaks. That's your citrus trees, which we don't really have here. Carpinus, that's your blue beech. Fagus, which is your true beech. And Tilia, which is your linden trees, your basswoods, things like that. There's an example of a tree that is decayed, but you can see it's still standing quite a bit. And it's been amazing here in Silent Lake, seeing some trees that are very, very decayed, standing quite strong and tall. Here's another image of my lovely wife. This is actually at the National Arboretum. You can see she's looking at me through this tree, quite the hole in it, but it is still standing. And this is one of those points I really want to hit home. Just because the tree is decaying doesn't mean it's a risk of failure. That tree that my wife is standing in under or smiling through, that has been through every single storm. And this is one of those things I want to leave everybody with before we go to questions. Every tree that you look at tomorrow and in the weeks to come that is standing has stood through every storm, every ice storm, the derecho, right? And so give yourself a little bit of peace of mind, because for all of the trees that fail, for the tree failures that we see after storms, well, in an inventory of 80,000 plus trees and 285 hectares, if we had 80 trees fail in a storm, and that happens from time to time, but if we had 80 trees fail, that's 1/10 of 1% of all of the trees. That is a 99.99% success rate. That's incredible. Trees overwhelmingly resist failure, overwhelmingly. So give yourself a little bit of peace of mind there. Don't let decay freak you out, and understand that what we're doing as professionals in urban forestry is really approaching things, especially in the city of Burlington, with a lens of integrated pest management, which includes good planning and understanding what we're dealing with. And so with that, I think we're almost exactly at 8 o'clock. I'm going to bring Kale into it to moderate some questions.
Hi everyone, I'm back and just wanted to first offer an extreme thanks to Kyle for sharing all of that information with us. I don't know about all of you, but there's so much information, and I feel like the more you learn, the more you realize there's just so much to learn. And hopefully you found it like inspiring and intriguing because, like Kyle is probably going to do, you could spend your entire life dedicated to learning more about trees, and there's always going to be more to learn, and we're discovering more every day. So just another thanks to Kyle for giving us all that
So
information. And I
fun.
wanted to, right? Did we have fun, guys? Was it a great time, or is it just me? I wanted to start the Q&A with the people who had submitted questions in advance. So the first one comes from Godfrey, who I see here today. And I'm just going to read their question to you, and then Kyle, you can respond. So Godfrey
Thank
has,
you.
and I like this, it's in quotations, my Bimmy oak, planted in 2020, is badly swollen at grade below the plastic pipe collar. Does this reveal anything unhealthy in the tree?
Interesting. So if it's a Vimeo, I want to say it's a fairly young tree. Um, if it's swollen, sometimes I would say look for any signs of insect damage. And sometimes what happens too is if people plant and they put something at the base of the tree to kind of protect it from things, sometimes that can make things a lot worse. So that's if you have a collar, if you've added too much mulch, those are always the issues. If it's less than, say, 5 centimeters in diameter at the base, I wouldn't worry too much about it. What I would suggest instead is keep an eye on it, take a photo, and watch how it grows. Because a lot of the time, what people will do is they'll try and say, "Oh, well, last year it was like this. Do you have any photos?" No, that's hard for me. Photos are a perfect record, or not a perfect, but near perfect record of what the tree used to look like. And over time, that will make a big difference. So I hope that helps.
That's some great advice. Thank you so much. And everyone who has asked the questions, as Kyle's answering them, I'm doing them in order. But if you have any follow-up questions to that, and I see Godfrey here, how was that answer, my friend?
It helps.
Oh, you muted yourself right after you said, I think it helps. I'm gonna say that probably did help. Feel free to pop it in the chat, Godfrey, if there's more follow-up questions.
A few words.
Man, you were right. How many do you need to say thanks? So we have another question from Linda, and their question is not to plant near septic. They have a tree that's growing fairly close to the septic, I'm assuming septic system, and wondered if it's okay.
Mhm. Okay, I love these septic questions because they're that's exactly a good question for an arborist. You want to avoid anything with aggressive roots. Uh, tree of tree of heaven. Hopefully, you never plant it. Nobody should ever plant a tree of heaven. Just want to be clear on that. Tulip trees, willows, silver maples. Avoid those at all costs. Manitoba maples. Good trees to have near a septic. If you're once again 10 meters away minimum, that's 30 feet. I know that sounds a lot. You can go as little as 5 meters, but once that tree starts to grow, 5 meters is not that far. Roots can be aggressive. So, good trees to plant near, I would say none, unless it's a small tree like an ironwood, blue beech, um, dogwood, things like that, that don't, they'll get to 25, 30 feet maximum in their lifetime. You don't want to plant a tree that's 100 feet tall next to your septic. Like a tulip tree, they grow really quickly. Silver maples grow really quickly, and they will actually look for water. Another one to avoid near septic is a birch. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next question here is from Carmen, who I also see in our audience right now. So there's an 80-foot spruce tree with a double trunk. We're wondering what your thoughts were of us cutting off the top of the tree so that it's not quite as heavy when the wind is intense.
Okay. Oh man, I wish we had an hour just to talk about this. So what you're talking about there with this tree is a co-dominant leader. So, well, shoot. Okay, a co-dominant leader. This is so for the folks out there with a double trunk. So you've got basically a spot where it breaks off like this. And the person is saying, what happens if we cut this off? Well, it depends on where you cut it off. Now, there's a rule of thumb that 30% is the maximum you remove from your trees. But let me be very clear. That's 30% of your ability to absorb food. That's a lot, right? If we were operating at 30% less efficiency tomorrow, we'd be a lot less efficient. So the 30% rule, it's a general rule of thumb for smaller trees. Once you get to older trees, you shouldn't remove more than 20%, really. And what's happened with a tree like this, so if we're talking about, and Kayla, you can still see my screen, right?
Yes.
Like, okay, you can see the little doodle that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So what we're seeing here with this spruce, if it's large, and it sounds like it was, did they say 100-foot spruce tree?
80 foot.
80 foot, still pretty damn big, pardon my French. Um, Once you start to work on removing limbs, you are actually removing stabilizers. So all of these little branches, when a big wind comes in, these actually dissipate energy, right? Because the wind energy is forces. And the way trees are meant, because amazing, this just to blow everybody's mind, we are on we are above one ocean of water, but we are actually at the bottom of an even larger ocean in the planet Earth, and that is an ocean of air, right? There are these massive currents that go and move, and we're just at the very, very bottom of this. I feel like it just blew Kale's mind. That's the goal. And what all of these trees are, they're just pieces of seaweed in this giant ocean of air. And the difference is that it doesn't hold, it's not a buoyant, right? Air is nowhere near as buoyant as water. And so if you have a tree failure, well, that can be a big deal if it's 80 feet tall. So going back to my little diagram here, you can see in the background of this picture, there's a large limb that's coming out of that tree in the background, right? It goes all the way out here. So that piece, when I moved in, I had a neighbor say, "Oh, are you going to cut that off?" It's like, no, that's a shock absorber. That giant limb is a shock absorber. And when you have two tops, typically speaking, you want to subordinate. You want to actually choose what leader you want to be the main leader when the tree is small, because now it's like a congenital, the I don't know if Siamese twin, conjoined twin, pardon me, is the correct term. It's like a conjoined twin. They their entire lives. And so you remove one of the isn't going to be able to take all of that power from the wind at the bottom of this giant ocean of air that we're in. And so what's going to happen is it's going to shed, it's going to have to dissipate energy, and it will dissipate energy by dropping limbs. If you have a codominant top, you want to do a gentle reduction, and it's amazing what you can do. Take 10 or 15 feet out of the top. You're not talking 30%, usually speaking. It's still quite a bit. It's going to be expensive as far as an arborist is concerned. It's going to be technical as far as an arborist is concerned. But if you only take 10 to 15 feet out, it might not seem like that much. But if you do that, you're actually going to still leave quite a bit of tree for energy to be dissipated in windstorms. The other thing that you consider doing is talk to your arborist about getting a cable done. And so what a cable is if we have these trees like this, here's another example. We do this in the city from time to time, depending on the circumstance. Oh, I hope I didn't lose you there, Kale.
Nope.
The cable will go around. Perfect. And actually connect those two pieces together. And it's a good way of preserving a tree and limiting the risk of those pieces splitting. So I always say to folks, if you have a chance, that's another good way to preserve it. The good rule of thumb is that you should never leave a 10 centimeter diameter cut or greater on your tree. So if you're taking off like that one in the background here, I'm going to do a little arrow there. Taking that off, that would have been about a 24 centimeter diameter cut, right? So almost a foot in diameter. That tree's never going to be able to properly compartmentalize it, and it's going to lead to decay and a major cavity. If you're 10 centimeter diameter cuts and lower, that is your ideal because it throws off the health and the structure of the tree. And it will allow the tree to close without really having a smaller risk of a cavity. I do encourage if there are more questions about that, email the folks at Burlington Green because I love talking about tree structure. And there's a lot of folks out there who will say, yeah, totally, you can cut half of this tree out, and you can, but there's going to be consequences and risk, right? If we go all the way back to the beginning slide here. Getting ready for a question. Just 1 second there, Kale. I want to get to this one. You see here, the bottom line is risks, right? So the host, if we're looking at that, we're talking about a spruce, the environment, typical Burlington urban environment, pest disease. The issue, it's actually not a pest or disease at all. It's a structural issue, which is codominance. What's the future? The future is it's going to continue to be codominant unless we do anything. So techniques, you can cut half that tree out. It's going to be expensive, right? And it's going to look terrible, and it's going to have really high risk. It's not the best management approach. I uh, highly discourage you from that. But hope that helps. Do encourage more questions about that. And Kale, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I would just echo what Kyle had mentioned is if you have more questions, maybe pop them in the chat. We'll see if we can get time for them today. But if not, you can certainly email us after, and we have a feedback form that we'll send. So you can definitely put it in the last comment section too. and we will make sure that it gets to Kyle so we can get those questions answered when we send out our follow-up email from this. Great answer. Thank you so much for that, Kyle. The next question is from our friend Sam in the audience, and they would like to know, what's a good plant to replace boxwood with?
So the big one that the industry is going into right now is beech trees. Beech hedges and yew hedges. Um, that's what I would suggest. You can also go with spirea. One of the things I like about Canada yew is that it's native. And one of the things I always say to folks, though, like if you have hedges, you have to spend a ton of time keeping them like that every year. And if they're tall, they cost money. I love hedges, but it's a commitment. It's like a marriage, you just have to put a ton of time into it. Sometimes it's not going to be rewarding, but they're nice, but it's also expensive. Uh, there you go. Kale, back to you.
Fantastic. I say maybe my favorite analogy so far. We have another question from the wonderful Mark in the audience here, and Mark would like to know, they have a large limb, or they have to remove a large limb they have to remove a large limb off a large maple on their property, and would like to know how close to the trunk should they cut off the limb?
Okay, so this is one that always drives people nuts, but I always say if you have to remove a large limb, and if you're defining it as large, it's probably large enough that you should consider calling an arborist. Because the kicker I always find with folks, can I use this one? Yeah, we'll go over here. If you're cutting off a limb, no, go back. If you're cutting off a limb, let's get my pointer out. You've got a limb that's coming out this way. So what you want is you want to find this thing called the branch bark ridge. And it's usually right around here, and that's your collar. And you want to go out an inch or two. For myself, as a master arborist, that is the sign of my master work. That is a sign that I am a master because I take great care and great joy in cutting a really good collar cut, leaving something behind that is going to A, help the tree seal itself well, and B, look really good. And oftentimes what happens if people are taking large limbs, they'll go and they'll cut in the wrong spot, and then what you'll get is a tear where this whole piece will actually fall. That's how you get a lot of injuries. And I always encourage folks, if you're going to do your own tree work, you should sit down with yourself and whoever you're planning to do it with and look at tree fails for at least 20 minutes on YouTube. Just watch 20 minutes of tree fail videos and ask yourself if it's worth it. Because I've seen a lot of people, and I've spoken to probably about 6 or 7 people in my career. It's about one every 2 years who knows somebody who's in a wheelchair now because they wanted to save $400 or $500 on tree work. Very expensive. It's being and being hurt is much more expensive than that $300 or $400. So keep that in mind. And if you are cutting a large limb off, like I said, try and avoid anything more than 10 centimeters, because if you cut more than 10 centimeter limb off, in diameter, right? Not length, right? This could be 15 centimeters long or 15 feet long and be 10 centimeters at the collar. If you leave a wound that's more than 10 centimeters in diameter, you are shortening the life of that tree, guaranteed. But if it means, well, we either cut down the tree or we cut this limb, then cut down the limb and see the tree live longer than it would have been if you would have cut it down. And so yeah, look for that branch bark ridge. I think that was Mark who asked that question. And if you're doing it yourself, also strongly advise look up tree fails on YouTube. And really for anybody, it's just very interesting stuff. I love watching that stuff. It's very sobering.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Comment in the chat for Mark, who's confirming it will be done by an arborist. So excellent, excellent, excellent. And also just some thanks
Fantastic.
from the previous question askers for your answers to the question. Excellent. So I have one more here, again from our friend Sam in the audience. So, speaking as Sam, I'm going to start a mushroom garden for lion's mane on some freshly felled silver maple logs in a shady part of the backyard. It's pretty close to some massive black walnuts, though. Is cultivating this mushroom a problem next to mature black walnuts? And then in brackets, it says some have dead branches.
Oh my goodness. This is I love mushroom questions like this one. I actually just did a talk for the Dunville Horticultural Society on mushrooms, and it was lovely. Especially when people ask about growing mushrooms. So lion's mane on maple. So just to be sure to be clear for everybody, um, if you're growing mushrooms, it should always be on a tree that when it was cut down was healthy. You don't want to use old wood because old wood already has decay fungi living in it 90% of the time. Um, and so about putting lion's mane underneath walnut, I wouldn't worry about it at all. The most important thing, once you've inoculated, do not skip the sealing step. I've made this mistake a couple times before, and I'm a big believer if you're going to do anything, you should do it badly the first couple times you do it, because then you're going to learn what works and what doesn't. If you inoculate mushrooms, or inoculate wood with mushrooms, and you don't seal those plugs with wax, the fungus will die before it actually inoculates the wood properly. It's a tried and true technique with everything from oyster mushrooms to shiitakes. You have to make sure that you seal it. And then the next step is once you've sealed those spawn in the wood and you are putting that wood out, just making sure that it's in good shade and a good moist environment. The lion's mane isn't going to shorten the life of the walnuts, and the walnut's not going to impact the lion's mane more than putting it in a bad environment will. So keep that in mind. Love that question, and yeah, keep growing mushrooms.
Excellent. They've confirmed that the tree is healthy. The people next door just wanted to take it down. That base.
Good use of that wood. That's awesome. Way better than putting it through a chipper. Love it.
Excellent. So there's one more question that just popped into the chat, and that's probably all the time for questions we'll have today. Again, mentioning that if you have more questions, you can submit them in our feedback form. We will definitely send them to Kyle. So the question is from Enrique, who I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly, but we've grown an orange tree from seed, and they would like to know, would it survive winter if they planted it outside?
Love that people want to grow oranges. They are fantastic trees. Um, it will not grow. If you It will die if you put it outside. So oranges are part of the citrus genus. And I mentioned earlier, citrus is actually a really good compartmentalizer, really resistant to decay. Um, I was lucky enough to get to prune a lot of citrus trees when I was in Australia, lemons, grapefruits, oranges. Had some of the best oranges I've ever had off of fresh orange trees. So can't recommend that enough. Um, the thing to keep in mind, they're not meant for our zone. So for Enrique, I would say look up what zone the orange tree will grow in. And the most northern zone probably be in the, I would say 10 range, 9 or 10, which is basically your the just south of the Mason-Dixon line, so like Virginia sort of area, where their winters are like 15 degrees, 10 degrees, right? It doesn't really typically get below zero. A fun fact, I love telling the story. My mentor down in Australia, I was asked to prune a couple orange trees, and I pruned them like I would in Canada. So very gingerly and gently. And he said, "Mate, you're doing it all wrong." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The only way that you know you've pruned an orange tree properly is if you've been pruning it for about 20 minutes to an hour, and then you step back to look at it and you go, 'Oh my God, what have I done? Oh, I've ruined this tree.' That's when you know that you've pruned an orange tree well." They are really prolific growers. Once you get them established, if they're healthy, they're fantastic. I will say, growing them indoors, for Enrique, familiarize yourself with spider mites because they will be a pest that you'll kind of struggle with if you're growing citruses indoors. But otherwise, love it. Love the adventurous attitude there. That's awesome.
Excellent. I'm just going to sneak one more in as a follow-up to the orange trees. Sue was
Sure.
asking, can an orange tree spend the winter inside a garage? And said that a neighbor of theirs does that with a fig tree, brings it outside in the summer, and that it does grow figs.
Yes. So fig trees, there is a whole subculture of fig trees, like fig growers, believe it or not. Like, oh yeah, it's this world is so weird. There's like a whole group of people are just so passionate. You'll meet them and they're into like other plants, but they're not into nothing. Like they're more into fig trees than I am into mushrooms and trees. Like it's crazy, some of these people. Oh yeah. I love it. Anytime I meet somebody who's excited about a plant, even if it's not one that I like, I'm just overjoyed. And so if you leave it in the garage, that's one thing. Because one of the things with figs, they need darkness, they need cool but not cold, right? And so if you want to overwinter your citrus so that it goes through a period of dormancy, absolutely consider that. I wouldn't go with the same as the fig because once again, what are the growing zones of the fig versus the growing zones of the orange that you're actually trying to grow? And keep in mind, what kind of seed did you plant? Did you plant uh like a Valencia orange seed, or did you plant a clementine, or did you because those are all important factors, right? It's like growing a Macintosh apple versus growing a pink lady. So learn what you're growing. And I mean, you don't need to get it down to exact science, but if you're enjoying this and you want to do it well, find out what their series their growing zone is, compare it to your neighbor's fig, and I think that you probably could do a dormant, like get it past the winter in the garage because it's not going to get like frozen. But if you have it in a pot and those roots get frozen, it's toast, right? Because what happens is, just like a person, if a plant freezes entirely, now we don't our our native vegetation doesn't have that because they have a whole process of protecting themselves. Plus, they're in the soil where the soil doesn't freeze that deep, right? But you put it in a pot and those roots freeze, the water in the roots expands and destroys the cells, and then the plant will be dead. So gingerly, if you're going to put it in the garage, just keep a close eye on it. And yeah, do a little bit of reading. There's tons of books on orange cultivation and fruit cultivation out there that I mean, it's a deep rabbit hole. And like I said, the folks that love fig trees, they're a great resource. They're some of my favorite nerds out there.
Awesome. Fantastic. I'm going to wrap up the Q&A. That was all the questions. There are a few comments in the chat. If you're here and just aren't reading the chat, just catch up. There's some cool comments there. But I wanted to share a few exciting opportunities that we have upcoming for Burlington Green.